They thought it was just another stray in the woods. But when a mute girl drew its eyes before anyone had seen them, when a loyal dog refused to leave its side, and when the town whispered louder than the wind through the pines, one man had to choose between the law he swore to follow and the life that silently begged him for a chance. This is the story of a vet, a child who could not speak, and a creature the world wanted to forget, until love once again proved it could rewrite fate. It was a bitterly cold night in late autumn, and the wind moved through the pine trees outside Pinewood Hollow like a whispering tide. Frost crept along the edges of car windows, and the last golden leaves clung stubbornly to bare branches. Dr. Nathan Cole had just closed up the Pinewood Hollow Veterinary Clinic when Ranger, his 6-year-old German Shepherd, pricked his ears toward the forest and let out a low, insistent whine. Ranger wasn't a dog who cried for no reason. Nathan, a tall man in his 40s with steady hands and the quiet demeanor of someone who had long since made peace with solitude, looked down at him with concern. The dog's eyes, deep amber and intelligent, were fixed on something beyond the trees. "All right, boy," Nathan murmured, pulling on his coat. "Let's see what's out there." The forest trail behind the clinic was narrow, its dirt path covered in damp leaves. Nathan followed Ranger by flashlight boots, crunching softly in the dark. After about 5 minutes, the dog stopped nose low to the ground, tail still. There, beneath a fallen branch on the side of the old access road, lay a tiny motionless creature. It was no larger than a rabbit curled in on itself, nearly hairless and trembling. Nathan knelt down, careful and slow. The thing's breaths were shallow and its skin felt cool beneath the scarf he used to wrap it. "A puppy," he whispered. Or something close enough. He turned back toward the clinic without another word, Ranger trotting protectively at his side. Inside, under the soft yellow light of the exam room, Nathan gently placed the bundle on a heating pad and fetched a pediatric stethoscope. The small creature wheezed weakly, barely moving. Its limbs were spindly, its skin almost translucent in places, but Nathan didn't pause to analyze. Right now, it needed warmth, fluids, and care. As he adjusted the heat lamp, the clinic door creaked open quietly behind him. It was Ava Morrison. Ava was 11, slight and soft-footed, her honey-blonde hair tied back in a loose braid. She came often, almost every afternoon, to sit quietly in the corner of the waiting room and sketch the animals. Since the accident that had taken both her parents 3 years ago, Ava hadn't spoken a word. No one pushed her. Not her grandmother Charlotte, who waited patiently outside in the car. Not Nathan, who simply left a small basket of colored pencils and sketchbooks for her near the front desk. Tonight, Ava stepped in silently as always, her blue eyes sweeping the room, before locking on the creature on the table. She didn't say a word. She never did. She only watched. Nathan looked at her for a moment, then back at the pup. "Found it just now. Might not make it through the night," he said softly, knowing she wouldn't respond but feeling the need to say something. Ava didn't move closer. She didn't draw. She simply stood in the doorway, eyes fixed on the fragile thing that Ranger had found and that Nathan now fought to save. Outside, the wind howled through the trees. Inside, the three of them, man, dog, and girl, watched the small, strange creature breathe each shallow breath like a thread holding it to life. The overhead fluorescent light cast a pale, clinical glow across the metal exam table. Nathan Cole stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the small creature lying curled in the nest of warmed towels. The heating pad beneath it hummed softly. Though the worst of the cold had been pushed back, the little thing still trembled faintly, its limbs twitching now and then with uncertain life. In the clarity of this artificial light, the strangeness of the creature became impossible to ignore. Its skin, pinkish gray and nearly hairless, clung too tightly to spindly limbs. What little fuzz it had was sparse and uneven, offering no real warmth or protection. The closed eyelids were set too far apart, and underneath Nathan could see the bulge of unusually large eye sockets. The snout was long and thin, sharply tapered in a way that didn't match any breed he recognized. He leaned closer and gently lifted one foreleg, examining its bone structure and delicate paws. It didn't stir. Ranger sat nearby, his thick coat bristling slightly with the static charge of the room. His posture wasn't tense. In fact, it was almost reverent, protective. His ears were forward, not flat. He hadn't barked once. His presence beside the table seemed not only calm, but intentional, like he understood something Nathan didn't. A quiet rustle behind him broke the silence. Ava was back. She entered the room without a sound sketchbook in one hand, pencil in the other. She didn't ask permission, she never did, but Nathan didn't mind. She always seemed to know when she was needed. She took her usual seat in the corner, curled her legs up beneath her, and flipped her sketchbook open to a fresh page. Her eyes darted between the creature and the paper. Her hand began to move. Nathan turned back to the table, adjusting the heating lamp slightly to one side. He touched the creature's side, feeling the shallow rise and fall of its breath. Weak, but steady. That was something. 10 minutes passed in silence. Then 20. Ava stood. She crossed the room slowly and stopped just short of the exam table. Holding up her drawing, she turned it toward Nathan. It was a detailed image of the creature's exact proportions, eerie clarity, and most striking of all, its eyes were open, huge and black with an unnatural depth. Behind the creature in the drawing, Ava had sketched tall looming pine trees and a jagged mountain ridge. Nathan looked at her. She didn't speak, she never did, but she raised her arm and pointed toward the background of her sketch, toward the mountain. Then she pointed out the window toward the forest behind the clinic where the horizon was swallowed each night by the looming peaks of Pine Hollow Ridge. No one went up there anymore. Nathan stared down at the sketch, then back at the creature still breathing in soft, silent intervals beneath the light. Ranger rose, slowly padded over and sat beside Ava, his body lightly touching her leg. His eyes stayed on the creature. Nathan exhaled. Something wasn't right, and Ava knew it too. The frost had not yet melted from the pine needles when Nathan set out the next morning, the sun just beginning to stretch pale fingers across the treetops above Pine Hollow Ridge. The mountains loomed in the distance, mist curling like smoke between their folds. After a nearly sleepless night of tending to the strange creature, his questions had only deepened, not lessened. And there was only one person in town who might know more than he did, Sam Whitaker. Sam was a relic of the old Pinewood, a man in his late 60s who had lived off-grid for decades in a weather-warped cabin tucked between the trees north of the river bend. Thin and wiry, with a sun-leathered face and a wild mane of silver hair, Sam was known for his sharp instincts, deep knowledge of wildlife, and fierce dislike of bureaucracy. Most folks in town called him that old forest ghost, but Nathan had spoken with him several times over the years, usually about injured eagles or foxes found near the clinic. Sam didn't trust people, but he trusted animals. That counted for something. Nathan parked his truck at the edge of the unpaved logging trail and walked the rest of the way in. Ranger trotted at his side ears, twitching always ahead, but never out of sight. After nearly 20 minutes, the trees opened slightly into a small clearing, where Sam's cabin stood surrounded by hanging deer bones, wood stacks, and rows of traps rusting in the earth. Sam was already on the porch, a steaming tin mug in hand. He wore a tattered flannel shirt layered over thermal wool, his jeans patched at the knees and coated in dirt. His boots looked older than the clinic's oldest surgical lamp. "You look like hell," Cole Sam called without smiling. Nathan offered a tired wave. "Didn't sleep much. Dog find something?" Nathan stopped at the bottom step. Something strange. Not quite a dog. That earned him a pause. Sam took a slow sip of his coffee and nodded toward an old bench beside the woodpile. "Tell me." Nathan described it every detail he could recall. The translucent skin, the large eyes, the delicate limbs, the unshakable stillness with which it slept, and how Ranger had reacted, not with suspicion but with quiet vigilance. Sam listened in silence, his expression unreadable. He set down the mug and scratched his chin where a streak of white beard had grown in uneven. "You say the girl drew it?" he finally asked. Nathan nodded. From memory, or maybe instinct. Sam squinted toward the mountains. "Blackwood's Edge." "You know it?" Sam gave a short laugh, dry as brittle leaves. "I used to trap up there before they shut the trail. Government sealed part of it off back in '96, claimed it was unstable rockslide danger, but some of us knew better." Nathan frowned. "Better? How?" There were rumors, Sam said, standing now, stretching his arms slowly, of experiments, research stations hidden among the trees, genetic labs, quiet work, military contracts, things bred then abandoned. Nathan's face darkened. "That sounds like paranoia." And yet Sam said, leveling him with a sharp look, "You brought a creature into your clinic that looks like nothing you've ever seen." Ranger gave a low whuff beside them. Sam glanced at the dog. "That one sees what others don't." "So what is it?" Nathan asked. "Not a dog." Then what Sam's voice dropped. "A coyote, or something close, but not born in the wild. Bred." Nathan sat still, the cold seeping into his hands. Why would anyone do that? Sam's eyes narrowed. Why does the government ever do anything? Control. Testing. Creating something useful until it becomes inconvenient. Nathan didn't respond. A wind rustled through the trees, sending pine needles drifting to the ground like ash. "Be careful," Sam said finally. "If it's from Blackwood's Edge, there's more where it came from. And they might come looking." Nathan nodded slowly. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Sam muttered, turning back to the cabin. "Just don't let that thing end up in the wrong hands." Nathan and Ranger returned to the truck, the wind behind them colder than before. Back at the clinic, Ava was waiting by the back door, seated on the ground with her legs folded and sketchbook resting on her knees. Her cheeks were red from the cold, but she didn't seem to notice. She looked up as Nathan approached, her blue eyes searching his face. Without a word, she reached out and took Ranger's paw gently in her hand. He sat beside her, calm as a statue. Nathan crouched beside her. "You've been here long." Ava shook her head and opened her sketchbook. The newest drawing showed the small creature sleeping in the towel nest, but now there was a word above its head written in Ava's neat block letters, Lark. Nathan raised an eyebrow. "Lark?" Ava pointed to the creature, then touched her chest with her fingers, her own version of naming. Ranger gave a short huff, as if in agreement. Nathan stood slowly and held the door open for her. "All right then, let's go check on Lark." Inside, the creature Lark was still curled under the heat lamp. It stirred slightly at their entrance, letting out a faint sound somewhere between a chirp and a whimper. Ava walked to the edge of the table, raised her fingers and repeated the motion she'd shown outside, hand to chest. Lark's eyes blinked barely open and then closed again. Ranger lay down beside the table. Nathan watched the three of them, dog girl, and something unknown held together by a thread invisible to everyone else. Outside, the sun slipped behind the clouds, and deep within the pines, something unseen watched and waited. By midweek, the air in Pinewood Hollow had shifted, though the snow hadn't yet come. The cold was beginning to settle deeper into the bones of the town. Frost lingered into the early afternoon, and even the mailman had switched to thermal gloves. But what bit more sharply than the cold now was gossip. It started at Miller's General Store, as most rumors in Pinewood did. An overheard conversation between Charlotte Morse and Ava's grandmother and Mrs. Elsie Chen, the elderly baker with a knack for gentle eavesdropping. Someone had seen Ava slipping into the veterinary clinic late, long after closing hours. Someone else mentioned Nathan's truck parked along the ridge trail at dawn. Whispers turned to speculation, and speculation in a small town was wildfire. Nathan had no idea how fast it had spread until the fourth call before breakfast on Thursday. The first was a polite inquiry from a local pet owner. The second was a thinly veiled curiosity disguised as a request to tour the clinic. By the third, he stopped answering. By the time he opened the back door for Ava that morning, there was a small group of people standing at the front gate, peering in through the frosted windows. Among them stood Gregory Denton, a thin man in his 50s who ran the Pinewood Hollow Gazette. He wore a stiff brown peacoat, silver-rimmed glasses that always slid too far down his nose, and had the perpetual smell of ink on his hands. Gregory didn't smile much, but he loved a mystery and hated being left out of one. Inside the clinic, Ava moved with a different rhythm than before. Where once she lingered in the corners today, she stood closer to the exam table where Lark rested. Her sketchbook stayed shut her eyes, watching instead. She had stopped using signs around the creature. Instead, she simply sat, hand sometimes resting gently against the table, waiting. Ranger stayed near her, his movements increasingly vigilant. His gaze frequently flicked to the hallway or the doors, as if already sensing what Nathan had not yet admitted, something was coming. That something arrived just after lunch. Two journalists, both young and wearing crisp city coats that didn't match the mood of Pinewood Hollow, stepped through the door without knocking. One was a woman with short, blunt-cut black hair and a notepad already open in her gloved hands. The other, a man with a press badge and camera slung over his shoulder, scanned the room like it was a zoo enclosure. "Dr. Cole," the woman asked brightly. "Tina Lewis, Channel 8. News. We heard reports about a rare animal being treated here. Wondering if we could ask a few questions." Nathan froze, mid-step syringe in hand. "I don't recall inviting media into a private medical facility." "Technically," she said, smiling, "we were invited by public curiosity. Rumor has it you're harboring something quite special back here." Before Nathan could reply, the man with the camera edged toward the exam room. Ranger stood instantly, body stiff, ears pinned. His growl was low deep and filled the space like a warning bell. "Back away," Nathan said, sharper now. "Is it true?" the cameraman pushed. "Is it a wolf pup, a hybrid? Some kind of government experiment? You need to leave. Now." But the man reached toward the door handle. The growl became a bark, sharp and sudden. Ranger lunged, not to bite but to block. He placed his body between the door and the stranger's chest-heaving teeth bared just enough to erase all illusion of friendliness. The man stumbled backward. Nathan moved between them. "He won't hurt you unless I let him. And right now, you're closer to that than you think." Tina raised her hands, face stiffening. "We'll go. But we're not the only ones asking questions." "Then let them ask," Nathan said. Outside. When the door shut behind them, silence fell again. Ava stood in the hallway. She had seen everything. Nathan walked toward her heart, still pounding, ready to reassure her. But before he could speak, she took a small step forward, her eyes wide but calm. Her lips moved slowly, uncertainly, but sound followed. "Don't hurt Lark." The words were hoarse, fragile, but they were there. Nathan stared at her, stunned. She hadn't spoken in 3 years, not a word, not a sound. She blinked quickly, looked down, and clutched her sketchbook to her chest. Ranger moved beside her, pressing his side gently against her hip as if to say, "She's safe." Nathan knelt. "Ava," he said softly. "Say it again." but she only shook her head and turned back toward the room where Lark lay resting. Nathan watched her walk away, a whisper of a voice echoing in the space between them. It wasn't just Lark that was waking up. Something in Ava, something buried and bruised, had cracked open too. Later that night, after the clinic had gone dark and the front blinds were drawn, Nathan sat at his desk with the sample package sealed and addressed to the Oregon State Wildlife Lab. Blood work, tissue swab, a full profile of something that shouldn't exist. He leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes. Outside, frost glittered beneath the porch light. Beyond the gate, two shadows stood for a moment watching, then faded back into the dark. The hours after midnight brought a silence that felt different, thicker, heavier, like the air itself was holding its breath. The clinic lights were dimmed to their softest setting, casting long shadows across walls lined with charts, photos, and faded posters about heartworm prevention. Outside, frost clung to the windows in feathery patterns, the parking lot empty under a silver moon. Inside it was warm, only in the narrow radius of the incubator's glow. Lark lay curled within the enclosure, her sides rising and falling rapidly, her breaths shallow and ragged. Her skin still mostly bare, except for the faint beginnings of a tawny coat, was flushed and warm to the touch. Her eyelids fluttered but didn't open. Every few minutes she let out a faint, breathless whimper. Nathan sat hunched on a stool beside the incubator, a clipboard resting on his thigh and a digital thermometer blinking in red. 104.1. The fever had spiked again. His sleeves were rolled to the elbows, forearms, tense jaw, locked in concentration. His shirt, a light blue scrub top, was wrinkled and smudged with faint stains from handling the IV tubing and mixing injections. His eyes, red around the edges, flicked between the monitors and the small body, fighting to breathe inside the glass. He knew the signs: lungs inflamed, likely pneumonia, setting and dehydration worsening. Lark had refused the latest feeding mixture, and now even fluids weren't being absorbed as they should. He'd started a low-dose antibiotic 2 hours ago, but it was too early to know if her system would take it, and she didn't have time. Ranger lay on the floor beside the incubator, his head resting between his paws, eyes open. Every time Lark whimpered, his ears twitched. Occasionally, he would lift his head and nudge the side of the incubator gently with his nose, then return to stillness. There was no barking, no pacing, just presence. Nathan reached out and gently placed a hand on the thick fur at Ranger's neck. "You knew," he murmured. "You knew the moment you saw her." No reply, of course. Just the warm, solid stillness of the dog who had become his shadow. It was well past 2 in the morning when he finally stood to stretch bones, cracking in protest. He walked out into the hallway toward his office to pull the latest vial from the medicine fridge when he noticed something on the floor, tucked just beneath the closed exam room door. A folded note. Handwritten on plain-lined paper. He crouched and picked it up, then unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was small, neat, and deliberate. At the top, in all caps, "Please save her." And beneath it, smaller, softer, "She's the only one like me." Nathan froze. Ava. He glanced toward the back door, still locked, then to the front, which was bolted shut. She must have crept out sometime after dinner and slid the note under without knocking. His heart twisted, not just at the words, but at the truth of them. Ava had seen in Lark what no one else had, something wild, yes, but also something broken and needing a place to be safe. And now Nathan was beginning to understand why. He returned to the incubator and stood there watching the creature fight her lungs, pulling at air like it cost her something. Ranger stirred and lifted his head again, nose close to the glass. Nathan made a decision. He pulled on his gloves, opened the emergency drawer, and selected a second antibiotic stronger broad spectrum. Riskier, but faster acting. He prepared the syringe and administered it with a practiced hand, watching for any immediate reaction. Lark flinched faintly, but then stilled again. Next, he adjusted the oxygen feed, raising it gently to help ease her struggling breaths. Then he sat down beside Ranger, one hand still on the incubator, and waited. Time passed in fragments. A minute at a time, an hour. By 4 a.m., Lark's breathing had steadied. The fever hadn't broken, but it had stopped rising. Her limbs weren't as stiff. Ranger lifted his head again, sniffed the air, and then lay back down. Nathan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He glanced at the note again, still open on the counter beside him. "She's the only one like me." He thought of Ava, of her quiet presence, the way she never flinched around blood or strange smells, how she had sat for hours beside Lark without needing words. She didn't just care for the creature, she understood her. And Nathan, after years of silence and solitude, was beginning to understand, too. This wasn't just a veterinary case anymore. It hadn't been since the night Ranger dragged him through the trees to find something abandoned and half alive in the dirt. He hadn't just rescued Lark. He'd rescued a piece of himself. Somewhere around 5, the first light of dawn began to color the edges of the sky. Nathan dozed briefly in the chair, chin tucked to his chest hand, still resting against the incubator glass. Lark stirred slightly more than before. Her limbs twitched, this time not in pain, but with a weak but natural stretch. Her nose wiggled. And then, just for a second, her eyes opened. They were wide, too large, black-rimmed with an amber gold center. Not human, not quite dog, but aware, and looking directly at Nathan. He blinked in surprise. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Then her eyes closed again, and she slipped back into sleep. Nathan sat very still, heart-thudding not from fear, but awe. Ranger made a soft noise as if approving and laid his head back down. The fever hadn't broken yet. But it would. The call came early, just after the first patients had been seen, and the clinic's morning hum had begun. Nathan stood behind the reception counter, thumbing through medication orders when the phone rang. The screen flashed Oregon State Wildlife Lab. He answered, breath held without meaning to. The voice on the other end was calm, clinical. The test results had returned. The DNA sample confirmed what Nathan had begun to suspect, but never fully wanted to believe the creature he'd been caring for, the small being, with fragile bones and wide flickering eyes, was a purebred coyote. No domestic dog markers, no crossbreeding. Wild through and through. He thanked the caller in a voice that barely felt like his own, and hung up without saying more. The law was clear. Wildlife, especially predators, could not be kept under private care without specific permits, and even those were limited. The next step, now that the results were confirmed, was mandatory transfer to a state-recognized wildlife rehabilitation center. Nathan leaned against the counter, the edges of the morning paper crinkling under his hand. In the back room, Lark was finally recovering. Her breathing had evened, her temperature had lowered, and she had accepted 2 full feedings overnight. She had looked at him, really looked at him the night before, and now, the moment she was starting to live, he was being asked to let her go. Out the window across the small gravel lot, a familiar figure sat curled on the wooden bench beside the clinic's side door. Ava. She had arrived early that morning, same as always, but instead of entering, she had taken a seat outside and stayed. Her coat was pulled tight around her, and her braid had loosened into soft waves that fell around her face. Her sketchbook lay forgotten on the bench beside her. She hadn't spoken, hadn't even looked up. Ranger lay at her feet, his massive form curled like a shield around her boots. Occasionally, he lifted his head to watch the door, then laid it back down. His presence wasn't casual, it was loyal, guarding her grief with quiet understanding. Charlotte had come by earlier to urge Ava to come home and prepare for school, but the girl had refused. She hadn't said no, she hadn't said anything. She had simply turned her face away. And Charlotte, frustrated but helpless, had left. By mid-morning, the frost on the ground had melted, but Ava remained. Deputy Grace Fuller arrived just after noon. She stepped out of her patrol vehicle with the same steady stride she always had, firm but never threatening. Her hair was pulled into a low ponytail under her hat, and her badge gleamed against the dark green of her sheriff's jacket. She glanced once toward Ava before entering the clinic. Nathan was at the back counter when she walked in. He didn't look up at first. Grace stood in silence for a moment, then spoke gently. "You got the call." He nodded. "Coyote, 100%. Then you know what that means. I know what the law says." Grace moved closer, resting her hands on the edge of the counter. "You've done more than anyone could have, and no one's questioning your intent. But now you have to let the right people take over. The rehab center's ready, they're trained for this. They'll teach her to hunt to avoid humans. She'll have a chance at a real wildlife." Nathan shook his head, voice low. "She doesn't know the wild, she knows this. She knows us." Grace's expression softened. "I've seen what you've done, Nate, and I know this isn't just about medicine anymore, but keeping her isn't an option, not unless you want rangers knocking on your door with court orders. You'll be risking your license, your future." Nathan looked away. "She's not just a case. She's a beginning." Grace sighed, then leaned in quieter. "You're not alone in this. I'll help. I'll speak to the wildlife department, make sure the transfer's done right. I'll make sure Ava's not crushed in the process. And I'll make sure no one twists this into something it's not." Nathan finally met her eyes. There was gratitude there and grief. Outside, Ava remained on the bench, unmoving. Her hand now rested on Ranger's head, and her face was turned slightly toward the clinic window, though her eyes were distant. Grace looked toward the door. "She's going to need help too, I know," Nathan said, "but today, I don't think she wants words." They stood in silence a moment longer before Grace turned to leave. "You've got until tomorrow to prepare. I'll handle the paperwork." When she stepped outside, Ava didn't look at her. Grace paused briefly as if about to speak, then thought better of it. She gave a short nod to Ranger and walked back to her car. Nathan watched through the window. One girl, one dog, one creature the world would call wild, but who had already made a home in hearts not ready to let her go. Autumn settled over Pinewood Hollow with the quiet authority of something ancient. The leaves turned to gold and rust, gathering in sleepy piles along the curbs. Smoke drifted lazily from chimneys, and porch pumpkins softened in the morning frost. It was the kind of season that made time feel slower, gentler, even if hearts still moved too fast beneath jackets and sweaters. Saturday morning dawned crisp and windless. The air carried a hush, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. At the town square, tents were being raised, hay bales stacked, and tables covered in red and white checkered cloths. The annual Pinewood Hollow Pet Festival had arrived. It was tradition. An event where children paraded their pets in silly costumes, the elderly brought blankets to watch from folding chairs, and vendors sold everything from dog-shaped cookies to hand-knit cat sweaters. But this year, there was something different in the air, a weight behind the celebration. Because this year, everyone had heard the rumors, and everyone in their own way had come for one particular girl, and one particular not-quite-puppy. Nathan arrived early, Lark resting in a modified pet carrier in the back of the clinic's truck, padded with fleece and pine-scented towels. She was stronger now. Her breathing had stabilized, and the soft fuzz along her shoulders had begun thickening into something between fur and wild brush. Her eyes remained luminous, watchful, curious, and just a little wary. Ranger sat alert in the passenger seat, eyes trained on the crowd gathering at the square's far edge. His coat shimmered under the rising sun, and every now and then he shifted, glancing back toward the carrier checking. Nathan stood beside the truck, arms folded, scanning the square. He wore his usual worn leather jacket, jeans, and work boots. His face was unreadable calm on the surface, but something sorrowful flickered at the corners of his eyes. Grace arrived shortly after. She wore civilian clothes this time, dark jeans, a forest green scarf, and a long coat belted at the waist. Without her badge, she looked softer, less official, but her stride still carried that purposeful steadiness. She greeted Nathan with a quiet nod. "You sure you're up for this?" she asked. "No," he admitted, "but I think Ava needs it." As if summoned by her name, Ava appeared from the crowd, Charlotte trailing a few steps behind. Ava wore a simple navy coat and brown boots, her long braid tucked into a knitted gray hat. In her hands, she clutched a large wooden clipboard with a single piece of thick paper clipped to it. Nathan stepped forward, concern already forming on his lips. "You don't have to do anything, Ava." But Ava just gave him a glance, steady, clear, and walked past him toward the small wooden stage set up beside the gazebo. A volunteer with a clipboard tried to intercept her, but Charlotte gently guided the woman aside, whispering something brief. The MC that year was Terrence Morrow, the town librarian. He was a tall man with a gentle stutter and a penchant for tweed, known for reading bedtime stories to both children and shelter animals alike. When he spotted Ava waiting quietly at the foot of the stage, he paused. With a nod of understanding, he stepped aside and motioned her up. A hush fell over the square. Ava climbed the 2 steps, her boots light on the wood. The microphone had been lowered for the children, but she ignored it. She walked to center stage and lifted her drawing. The image was done in charcoal and soft pastel. Ranger Midgard, his eyes blazing, his posture strong. Beside him, Lark, not how she looked now, but how Ava imagined her, fur full, standing tall, wild and free. Behind them was a backdrop of pine trees and swirling leaves. It wasn't just a drawing, it was a story. A story of love without words, of safety, of trust. A murmur moved through the crowd. Ava turned the picture slowly so even the furthest could see. Then, with no grand gesture, she lowered it and stepped back. She didn't speak, but she didn't have to. Her eyes scanned the crowd, pausing on Nathan, then on Lark's carrier, then on Grace. Then she stepped down and Charlotte wrapped a quiet arm around her shoulder. No applause came. Not because it wasn't deserved, but because sometimes silence is louder. An hour later, the festival began to wind down. Children posed for photos. Seniors sipped cider. But Nathan, Grace, and Ava stood by the clinic truck. It was time. Ranger jumped into the back first, sitting beside the carrier. Lark shifted inside, watching him with those alert, unknowable eyes. Grace opened the passenger door and nodded toward Ava. "Ride with me." Ava looked to Nathan, who smiled softly. "We'll follow close behind." The road to the Wildlife Center wound north along the edge of Blackwood Ridge. As they drove, the trees thickened, and the town slipped away behind them. In the back of the truck, Ranger never once looked away from the carrier. Nathan glanced at them through the mirror and whispered, "We're coming with you, Lark." All the way. The first snow had come early that year, brushing across the ridgelines like powdered sugar settling into the quiet creases of Pinewood Hollow. The roads were clear but glistening, and the evergreens wore a coat of frost that made them look older, wiser somehow, more watchful. Nathan's truck rolled along the gravel road toward the wildlife sanctuary, the hum of the engine soft beneath the muffled hush of winter air. Beside him sat Ava, bundled in her heavy green coat scarf tucked under her chin, cheeks flushed with the cold. She was taller now, not by much, but enough for Nathan to notice. Her presence had grown too. Where she used to fold herself into corners, she now held space. Quiet still, but no longer shrinking. Her hands rested on a small notebook in her lap, fingers idly tracing the edges. Ranger sat behind them, ears alert, head occasionally lifting to sniff at the crack in the window. At nearly 7 years old, the German shepherd had settled into a slow, quiet wisdom. His eyes no longer darted with nerves they observed. Measured. Remembered. It had been 3 months since they last saw her. 3 months since they stood in the cedar-framed intake room of the State Wildlife Sanctuary and said goodbye. Lark had been stronger then, eating, walking, responding to her caregivers. The team at the center led by Dr. Camille Rowan, a tall woman with silver-streaked hair, and a voice like oak bark had explained the plan: gradual rewilding, no unnecessary human contact, slow introduction to other young coyotes. A second chance at instinct. Now, on this snow-kissed morning in early December, they were returning not as rescuers, but as visitors. No promises had been made. They might not see her at all. The sanctuary's gate appeared through the trees, a tall iron arch dusted in frost. A man in a brown field coat stood by the post clipboard in hand. "Name's Robert," he said, offering a gloved handshake. His beard was thick and reddish-gray, his face lined from long days in the wind. "Dr. Rowan's out checking the lower enclosures, but she said you could come up." He pointed toward the overlook trail. "You'll want to stay by the tree line. We've got fresh snow cover, so Prince'll tell us more than eyes will." Nathan nodded his thanks and guided the truck a little farther in before parking beside a small visitor shack. They stepped out into the cold boots, crunching softly in the new snow. Ava pulled her scarf higher, not from cold, but from nervousness. Nathan gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "You okay?" She nodded once. They began the slow walk up the trail. Ranger moved ahead, sniffing the path but never straying far. The pines arched overhead, their long limbs bowing under snow's delicate weight. Everything was still, as though the forest itself were holding its breath for them. At the crest of a rise they paused. The trees thinned there, revealing a wide field below, edged by dense woodland. It was quiet, untouched. No movement. Nathan exhaled, not sure what he had expected. He looked down at Ava to offer her a quiet apology, but she was already writing. Her small notebook flipped open, and her pencil moved quickly across the page. Then she held it up to him. "She's close." Nathan read the words, then followed her gaze out toward the woods. And there she was. Far at the edge of the clearing, half-shadowed by trees, stood a figure that was at once familiar and impossibly wild. Lark. She was no longer the fragile creature they'd rescued. Her fur was thick now, tawny and silvered with winter, her body lean and strong. She stood tall, ears high, tail poised. But her eyes, those strange knowing eyes still wide and ringed with gold, were locked onto them. She didn't move, didn't step forward. But she didn't run either. Ava took a step closer to the ridge. Ranger joined her, not barking, not whining, only still. Then slowly, Ava lifted her notebook again and wrote 3 small words. She didn't show it to Nathan this time. Instead, she stepped forward and left it tucked against the trunk of a snow-laced pine. Lark's ears twitched. The wind picked up softly through the trees, shaking snow from the branches above. A flurry drifted across the field like a curtain. And when it cleared, Lark was gone, melted into the forest without a sound. Nathan stared at the place where she had stood. For a long time, no one said anything. Then Ava turned to him and passed him the notebook. She remembers. He smiled, the ache in his chest lightened by something deeper than relief. "She's home," he whispered. Beside them, Ranger's ears turned toward the pines, his head slightly tilted, as if listening. as if hearing her still. Sometimes the greatest miracles come not in flashes of lightning or the parting of seas, but in the quiet moments when a child who had forgotten how to speak finally finds her voice, when a broken man discovers healing through the life he thought he was saving, when a wild creature looks back and remembers love. Lark was never meant to be tamed, and yet she was never truly lost. Like so many of us, she walked a path shaped by pain, mystery, and wonder. And through her we are reminded that God's grace often whispers, not in words, but in the wind between the trees, the loyalty of a dog, or the silent courage of a little girl. In this life, we may not always understand why we are called to love things that cannot stay. But when we do it anyway, when we care, protect, and let go, we reflect a bit of heaven here on earth. So, if this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a little light today. Comment your thoughts below, subscribe to stay with us on more journeys of hope, and let us know you're praying with us by typing Amen in the comments. May God bless you, protect those you love, and remind you that no act of compassion is ever wasted. Amen.